Hello and welcome back to Speed Demon Painting. Today we are taking a look at the Orbat changes that came through last weekend. They updated all of the Orbats at the same time to be version 3.03 regardless of what faction you play. The good news about these updates is that all of the key rules are now the same across all major factions, meaning that there are no longer Orbats that have a certain version of one rule versus other Orbats having a different version. So this is a major cleanup operation in some ways. This does mean, however, that there were quite a few things changed, and quite a few of these Orbats were fairly new, as in they had only been released a couple of weeks ago, meaning that you have to go through all of them again. And this is where I come in to help. I'll be going over all of the changes that happened to all the factions at the same time, so the ones affecting everyone, and I'll also be making a second video where I will be going over the major changes for each individual faction as well, and that'll be the one for next time. So this video is not about how every change affects each faction. That one will be coming out later, and if you're looking forward to that content, make sure you hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to the channel for those future updates. The first change is something that we see across all factions, and that is the addition of a new rule called a vulnerable stern. Now, I put this one at the number 1 as a side note. These are in no particular order, I'm just going through them one by one. What is the vulnerable stern? It makes it more rewarding to catch some ships in the rear arc if you're playing against them. And it dramatically increases the value of ships coming in via reserves and being able to more easily get into the aft arcs of a lot of ships. And it also means that if you're playing with ships with a vulnerable stern, that you will have to take care of where you position them as well, because it makes it slightly more risky. What does it do? Well, shooting attacks against this model, the one that has the vulnerable stern, that originate in the model's aft fire arc gain a devastating quality. Now, as a quick reminder, you have to take into account where the lead weapon, or rather which model has the lead weapon, and that is the point of origin for an attack. On top of that devastating quality, after any other effects or critical damage markers have been applied from that attack, if at least one point of damage has been caused by the attack, it inflicts a navigation lock critical marker if the target does not already have one. So it pretty much confers a magnetic rule as well to any attack being shot at the aft of those ships. There are some attacks where it doesn't matter if you have a vulnerable stern, and those are the ones with blast, bomb, or the magnetic quality itself. So, in other words, those weapons that don't have this sort of precise firepower where you can shoot at the rudder are not going to be affecting ships with a vulnerable stern. The second thing is that heavy firepower was slightly tweaked. It is not a massive redesign of what it was before, but you now have to declare that you use the heavy firepower before you declare initial targets. So the timing is changed slightly, or rather clarified. I shouldn't say changed, because it was never that clear to begin with. You can only declare what weapons support after the initial target is declared. So in other words, you can now sort of have a wait and see approach for your attack if your Valor effect actually works before you commit to supporting that lead weapon. So for instance, if you fire your main heavy gun battery at an opposing ship, you then get to go like, okay, I choose to declare heavy firepower. If your opponent chooses to cancel that one and manages to do so, you can then go like, right, I would rather not support this attack anymore because you cancelled my my effect. So yeah, it's a small tweak, but it's a welcome one. The third change that affects everyone is the fact that strategic reserves are now changed. If you have a battle fleet that has the strategic reserves as a battle fleet rule, you now either place your entire fleet in reserves, battle fleet that is, or none of it. So you do have to think a bit harder about creating a dedicated, preferably small battle fleet to hold in reserves. Why do I say small? Well, they only really come in at the bottom end of turn 2, and so the force that is deployed in the open is going to have quite a bit of an uphill struggle, so you don't want to go overboard with this one as well, and you do want to put a bit more thought into it when you're designing it one. It is again more of a clarification, however, than a massive rules overhaul. People were doing odd things like putting ships that they never intend to be placed in strategic reserves into them just to unlock a single unit or something to strike there, and that was not the sort of the design that they had foreseen, I suppose. At number 4, we have a few changes to generators. Some of them are tweaks. The first one is one that has a major impact, if you ask me. Using a shield generator is now a choice, and it's a choice that you cannot use if you want to benefit from shrouding too. This largely puts a stop to some rather abusive builds where you had generator ships giving shrouded and shield generators to pretty much everything in their vicinity, making them incredibly tough cookies to crack, and you can no longer do so. It also means that they are not the default option anymore for those generator ships as well, and you do sort of have to be careful about which ones you choose. Having said that, they did buff some of the other ones to compensate though. Magnetic generators in particular now also disrupt aerial weapons and not just SRS tokens. So it's both aerial weapons and SRS tokens now. And they act like a special version of flag barrage, and I'm going to read what the new rule says. It says any heavy hits against a model with this generator by weapons caused with the aerial quality or by enemy SRS must be rerolled. So in other words, if you're being shot at with rockets, this magnetic generator will also work. Exploding hits are, however, unaffected. On top of that, and this is where this is what I mean with a special flag barrage rule. Once per activation, this model may target itself or a friendly or enemy unit within 10 inch. Roll an action dice for each SRS token in base contacted with the targeted unit, the entire unit, and roll separately for each stack. Remove one SRS token for each exploding hit result. If the unit that you targeted was an aerial unit, then it also receives a level of disorder on the closest model in that unit. And you can't just use it without any consequences on to protect your friendly flying units. It doesn't quite work the same way as flag barrage, mind you, because you sort of still have to use it during the activation. If your opponent hasn't sent out his SRS tokens yet, when you're activating the one with a magnetic generator, it's not really going to help. However, it does, quote-unquote, democratize the access to anti-SRS tech. This, coupled with the tweaks that we've seen to carriers, means that they are still in a very useful spot, but they won't be the be-all and end-all like they perhaps were for a short time in the game. On top of that, there is a nice little tweak to the atomic generator. It has been boosted to also include +2 turn limit. So you're not just getting +2 speed, your ship also becomes slightly more agile and is able to corner faster on top of the speed increase, which is good. There are also a few tweaks to weapons, which I have classed at number 5. Gun batteries. Big stonks on those, because they have been buffed across the line. The smaller gun batteries, not the heavy ones, mind you, the small gun batteries generally got an extra support die on top of it. The new profile means that they can support with up to 3 weapons if they're supporting their bigger cousins, which is no joke. You can actually get a surprisingly large amount of firepower out of them now. And on top of that, you get an extra dice in closing range as well. So yeah, expect to see quite a lot more smaller frigates armed with gun batteries, because they can now stack up to a scary amount of firepower. On top of that, ramming weapons generally now have a crippled stat. It used to be identical, the crippled stat, compared to the battle ready one, but they now have a lower value in virtually all of them. And I used the Russian Semyonov assault bore as an example. In its crippled state, it is now only ramming 10, which is going to be important when we discuss what happened to Colossi a bit later on in this list, so keep your eyes out for that one. On top of that, this is not directly a weapon, but it does affect them. Focused gunnery also has been buffed a bit by allowing you to reroll the blanks when you're making that one boosted gunnery attack with that weapon, so it is a more valuable rule than it was before. And now, at number 6, the most redesigned thing of them all. Up until now, we were talking about smaller tweaks. This is actually quite an important change that we're seeing. And those are changes to unexpected arrival units or units that had a similar rule set. In the previous version, they would have to activate when all of the units in play had activated. And this led to some weird situations where your opponent couldn't quite respond to any units that had unexpected arrival, especially if it then also had the strategic retreat that they could do, and it sort of became a nearly uncatchable unit. It's different now. You now bring in your unexpected arrival units before any of your in-play units have activated. Except for turn 1. In turn 1 they just behave like any other reserve unit that you have, meaning you need to get that lucky exploding hit before they arrive. This has two major consequences. First of all, for your opponent, he gets way more response time to actually activate something to damage those units being brought in with unexpected arrival. And the major benefit for you, as somebody who plays with units with unexpected arrival, is that you're going to see a bigger impact on them as well. The biggest downside to these rules, or these units with this rule I should say, is that they came in at the end of all of your activation on turn 2. And if you've played the game before, it is absolute carnage in those first 2 turns. And if you had a big major unit having to wait for that long, the impact wasn't quite as big as you would prefer, meaning that it wasn't always worth taking a lot of units with this rule. On top of the changes in how they activate, you now also have to use the crippled stats for any ramming actions that they take. That was not the case before, you could just ram with your full value, so the tweaks to weapons that we saw previously have an impact here as well. On top of that, some units have a bit of a supercharged version, if you will, of this rule called the Sub-Marauder, and I will be mostly focusing the rules on those because they have been changed the most. Sub-Marauder states that instead of being deployed as normal for the encounter, the unit may instead be held in reserves. If it is in reserve in round 1, the unit must make a reserve roll as normal, meaning after everything is activated and you need that lucky exploding 6. However, from round 2 or any subsequent rounds, this unit may use this rule to immediately deploy from reserves. Unlike other units in reserves, units declaring that they are using this rule must activate and deploy before any other friendly units in play, meaning they have to go first and therefore have a bit of a bigger impact, but also give your opponent way more time to do something about them. When this unit uses this rule, it is placed at any point in the play area that is at least 2 inches from the nearest terrain feature. No model in the unit can be deployed touching another model, so there has to be a bit of difference when they do, and on the round it enters play with this rule, models in this unit may only fire weapons or ram using the weapon's crippled profile. So there's a bit of a nerf there in the output as well, luckily, because it was a bit much sometimes. At the start of the maintenance step of the end phase, and as a quick reminder, the maintenance step is the one at the very end of your turn, after everything is done, SRS tokens and everything. This unit may be removed from the play area again. If you do so, you have to leave any marker in a position of 1 model. The unit is then placed back into reserves. In the subsequent rounds, it may use this rule to be deployed again as outlined above, however it can only be deployed within 15 inches of the center of this unit's marker, meaning these units no longer, through strategic reserves, have the ability to just pop up on one side of the table and then just completely pop up somewhere else at the other side. And again, with your opponent having a full turn to respond to these units, I think we're finally going to see some Colossi actually being sank. I'll be brutally honest, I love using these guys. I have never lost the unit of my Colossi, because if you play it smart with your activations, you never have to, which was a bit of a frustrating NPE for your opponent, I imagine. After that we have change number 7. There are small tweaks to landing vessels now. First of all, there are more landing vessels for each faction. I don't think I've seen one that doesn't have one yet. And this appears to be a preparation for beach landing missions, coming closer to the end of the year. So this is something that you don't really have to take into account yet, but I'm mentioning it anyway because it is in the ORBATs. But yeah, that's something that's going to happen then. And on top of that, for those of you who are following Discord as well, there was a bit of a tease on the design of the new ground tokens, which appear to be these vehicles that some of the Wild West Exodus players might be familiar with. They are called the Iron Hides. They're sort of a weird pickup-like a pickup truck design that is just scooting across the seas to sort of make an infantry assault as well. And the rules for landing vessels are stated as below. Each model in the unit with the landing vessel, this is the change, can now place a number of ground assault tokens equal to its mass in a stack within 5 inch of the landing point. So it sort of seems to function like SRS with an ultra short landing, launch distance. The token stack must be placed on ground terrain, so you can't just have your little trucks and transport vehicles being in the sea. Once the stack of ground assault tokens has been placed using this model, then place this model at least 2 inch from the landing zones on which it docked in any direction desired. This model then loses the landing vessel rule for the remainder of the encounter, so it's like an SRS attack where you have a once in the game capacity to launch troops out of it. I'm not entirely sure how this is going to play out, but it does make me excited to see that these sorts of ground operations are coming back in a minor way, but still in a way in Dystopian Wars. And that's pretty much it for the rules, but I would be amiss to not mention this. This is a great little update at number 8. All factions now have identification guides at the very end of the Orbat, and it shows the renders of each ship with its weaponry, etc., that you can take. So it's definitely a help for a new player who just doesn't quite get what each ship is. Also, if you're wanting to select your force, it does help to sort of use the rule of cool and just assemble your models based on how you like the visuals of each one of them. So it's quite good. And as a cheeky little preview as well, we can actually see a couple of the new releases. I presume the ones from next month that are also shown in this identification guide. For instance, this lovely massive Ekranoplan, the Alexeyev from the Commonwealth Orbat, was leaked in there as well, so it's quite nice to find the occasional Easter egg in there as well. And actually, that was it in terms of generic rules changes that we've seen. I have to say I agree with most of them, because the ones that were a bit troublesome, like how the Colossi worked, for instance, was a bit a negative play experience for one side if they came on, and not always impactful for the one player using them. So it's good that it was tweaked, and on top of that, making gun batteries slightly better and increasing the variation in the generators are all things I can only applaud, so that's a good thing. There's, however, a couple of closing thoughts that we should end with. This Orbat update was hot on the heels of some of the other ones. I think my Alliance deep dive was only like a week or two old, or it was updated again. Mind you, it is also the faction that virtually got no changes whatsoever for their faction-specific rules, so, you know, not much of a hindrance there. The video is still very much applicable. And we have seen an absolute breakneck fast release schedule in these last few months. I mean, if you tally up how many releases they have made, it's more than it ever was before. And this sort of came hand in hand with an equally fast release schedule in terms of the rules. It needs to be said as well that you could argue that it was perhaps too fast as well. If you're somebody who is a more casual player and you're finding yourself facing new rules every other game that you play, it might become a bit much. So it might help some to find out that it was actually said quite categorically on Facebook that we won't be seeing any different Orbat changes for the next 6 months. At least not ones that will change the major faction rules like the recent ones have for now. In my personal opinion, ideally they only update individual units from now on for at least 6 months, just to get some stability and to make people familiarize themselves with those rules. And from that point on, only really tweak what needs to be tweaked, really, because I'll be honest, all of the games that we have played recently have been absolute nail-biters to the end. I know that a lot of damage gets done in the first 2 turns, I should say, but those last few units that make it across the finish line really do have a big impact, and once they start duking it out in that crippled state, it tends to be quite exciting just until the very end. So in my book, I've never experienced a game more balanced than it is now. We've never ever seen somebody being absolutely crushed while the other side has had virtually no damage taken, so that's a good thing. So, like I said at the very bottom of this one, I would like to see the framework for each faction now stay pretty much consistent. It is in a good place after all, especially now that a few of the outliers, namely the stacking of generators and how these unexpected arrival units work, have now been fixed. So yeah, let's hope they're able to do that. It doesn't bother me at all if a new unit gets released at this point, but it would be nice to see that your major faction rule, I'm going to use for instance, if you're taking the Alliance, the rule for the coordinated support should just stay the same for a couple of months. I think that'll massively help for stability and make sure that it's easier for those more casual players to still pick up the game and be familiar with how everything works as well. Those were the closing thoughts at the end. So if you have your own opinion about these, make sure you put them in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. It's always nice to hear a bit of feedback as well. And yeah, I do hope to see you in that next video where I'll be going over the major changes for each individual faction. That one will probably be slightly longer than this one, but yeah, it'll be interesting. I will make sure that there's chapters in there so you can go to your favorite faction or the one that you play to see how these changes affect you. I hope to see you in the next video. Bye!